Hello, welcome to Critical Conversations. I'm Carl Raschke. I'm the editor of the New Polis, and I'm also here with Roger Green, who's a contributing editor to the New Polis. We will be feeding today Arthur Bradley, who is a distinguished political philosopher, political theologian. I know he wears a number of hats. But he's very well known at the at Lancaster University in the UK, and he's been so gracious to join us to talk about his book, which is entitled Unbearable Life, which is on the topic of political erasure, which is especially relevant given what's been going on the last 2 weeks with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and some of the ideological rhetoric about erasing Ukraine, which is been in the news a lot. So we're not going to just talk about Ukraine, but we're going to try to look at this whole question of political erasure, which in terms of the academic literature or the philosophical literature on sovereignty is kind of a unique contribution that Arthur makes in the book. I'm going to turn it over to Arthur, and in just a minute, I want to say that for a variety of reasons, we're going to have a shift at the end of the first hour. I will be leading, or I guess you say, provoking Arthur for the first hour. This will be Arthur's show. Roger will be taking over for the Q&A the second hour because I have to leave for a university assignment. That being said, we're very glad to have you, Arthur. If you want to, know kind of about his bio, which I don't think we have to say a lot about, it's fairly extensive, but you can go on our website, thenewpolis.com, and read about it. So that being said, we'll get started. I may need to make one comment that this session is being recorded, and it will be put live at some point. So if you have any objections to being recorded or being part of a session that is recorded, you will probably have to sign off now. We don't encourage that, but if you really feel strongly about that, I think that is an option. At the same time, if you don't ask a question or say anything, you won't be recorded. You won't appear on the final recording. So that's your way out too. You can listen, but just don't say anything. But we assume that your participation in this 2-hour seminar is implicit consent to be recorded. That being said, we'll get started here. So, Arthur, I think we set this up, quite a while back before the war in Ukraine and the current global crisis became manifest in the way it did on February 24th. And that wasn't the intent, but in many ways, there are some very interesting parallels between the theme that you develop in your book, Unbearable Life, and what is happening right now. So could you kind of start off and explain what that is?
Okay, firstly, thank you so much, Carl. Thank you, Roger. Thank you to everyone at the New Polis. And thanks to everyone for coming as well. It's great to see some familiar faces and also some new ones. I'm very happy and honored to be here, to be able to talk to you about my work. And I really hope we can have a fruitful and interesting conversation. I think you're absolutely right, Carl, in that this is a particularly timely moment to be talking about this topic. I read an article in the Guardian newspaper in the UK the other day, which contained the following quotation from President Zelensky of the Ukraine. And he was referring specifically to Russia's attack on Babin Yar, which was the site of a Second World War massacre of Jews by German occupation troops and Ukrainian auxiliaries. And in response to this, Zelensky said, "This strike proves that for many people in Russia, our Kyiv is absolutely foreign. They don't know a thing about Kiev, about our history, but they all have orders to erase our history, to erase our country, to erase us all. And I thought a way into the conversation today is just to think about what exactly is meant by this thing called political or military erasure. What specifically is the difference between erasure and mere killing? Why is erasure worse than killing? Zelensky does not say he wants to kill us all. He says he wants to do something even worse than killing us. He wants to erase us. Well, I think the difference is that when you kill someone, obviously, you kill them in the present and you kill them in the future. They no longer exist. But when you erase them, you also kill them in the past. It's not that they once lived and now are dead, but they simply never existed in the first place. It's a total annihilation of life, which retracts even that very minimal recognition or dignity that the act of killing bestows upon us. To kill someone, you have to recognize at some very basic level that they are worthy of being killed, that they exist, okay? Even the act of killing contains that minimal act of recognition. But erasure is an act of erasing, taking away, subtracting even that minimal point of recognition. And then finally, and paradoxically, political erasure, political annihilation, also annihilates itself. It erases its own act of erasure. It's a strangely self-negating act, because if something does not exist, if you are retroactively annihilating something, then there is no need to annihilate it in the first place. So I'm just unpacking here just a couple of statements or hypotheses from Zelensky's statement. In the book, what I really try and do is tease out some of the political, philosophical, and theological implications of this phenomenon of political erasure. As we know, political erasure has a long history in the 20th century. We can think back to acts of proscription, acts of enforced disappearance, the political disappearance in many countries around the world, acts of censorship, what Trotsky called the Stalin school of falsification, where Stalinist Russia employed bureaucrats to retrospectively amend minutes to meetings, removing people from existence, airbrushing photographs famously to remove people from existence. This process of political erasure has a very long history. And in fact, in the book, I begin with ancient Rome and with the practice of damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory, which consisted of, again, erasing every trace of the existence of some proscribed person in one way or another, removing their property, knocking down or defacing their statues, coins, and so on that have their faces on them. So at one very simple level, I'm trying to tell the political story or the history of this phenomenon called political erasure in the book. But I'm not really a political theorist. What I'm interested in is the reasons why this happens, or perhaps the worldview, to put it crudely, the particular metaphysics of political erasure. What view of the world, what view of power, and what view of political power in particular does this act of political erasure imply? So what I try and argue in the book, my hypothesis, is that political erasure is not simply an extreme or aberrant instance of sovereignty. It's not simply an exception, or if it is an exception, it's the exception that in the Schmittian sense proves everything. Schmidt famously argues that the exception contains the essence of politics. So the second thing I want to do in the book, in addition to tracing in outline form some of the political forms that erasure takes, is to actually explore the history of sovereignty itself, the history of the theory of sovereignty through some key figures within its political and theological history, from Augustine through Hobbes up to Schmidt, Benjamin, and Foucault, in order to make quite a precise and, admittedly provocative, speculative argument. And it's the argument that this gesture of political erasure, as I've said, is not exceptional. Rather, it's the actualization, or it's the outworking of some essential possibility that's contained within sovereignty itself. And in the introduction to the book, I formulate it in this way. I say that sovereignty is not the power to make die and let live, as the ancient Romans had it, nor is it the power to make live and let die, as Michel Foucault famously has it in his work on biopolitics, but rather the power to make life neither live nor die. That life and death do not exist as empirical phenomena, as recognizable empirical phenomena, until that sovereign decision is taken. That there is a kind of originary, almost ontological, political ontological state of exception in which the subject exists until the sovereign takes the decision one way or another to let them enter the realm of existence. So I trace this argument, this phenomenon, as I've suggested, through various scenes, and each chapter focuses on a particular figure of this thing that I call unbearable life, life that neither lives nor dies, life that was never there, life that has been annihilated, and whose own gesture of annihilation has been annihilated. I focus on the figure of Cacus in Augustine's City of God. I focus on Macbeth in Shakespeare's play of that name. I focus on the figure of the Catacon in Carl Schmidt. I focus on the figure of Jephthah's daughter in Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. And I focus finally on Walter Benjamin, on Walter Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history, and where I focus in particular on what he calls the life that was never lived. There's a very famous and obscure and much debated passage in Benjamin where he says, what we envy in the past, what we seek to return to, what we seek to reactualize is not the life that we did live, but the life that was never lived. So in a sense, the book is a gesture of political recuperation. It's trying to give these voices back, to bring these unbearable, erased bodies back, to let them speak, to let them articulate themselves. And also, finally, to try and articulate a form of resistance to this act of political erasure. I mean, we all know that right now there is a very strong and courageous act of resistance going on in Ukraine to this gesture of political erasure. And what I try and do in the book is trace some of the ways in which, both in terms of philosophy and politically, different figures have sought to resist unbearable life, not simply by reasserting ever more strongly their right to exist, the fact that, yes, I am here, I am unerasable, but even in certain paradoxical cases, to take on and to mobilize this strange state of non-existence, of existing outside life and death, as a site of political possibility and revolutionary political possibility itself. So if it's okay with you, I think I'll stop there. Hopefully I've given people a general flavor of what I try to do and what my ambitions are for the project. And I'll hand back to you now, Carl.
Okay, great. I have quite a number of questions. And again, as we talked about prior to going live here, if we can kind of toggle back between the contemporary situation and also the theoretical matrix in which you're presenting this argument. So let me ask you just some questions a little bit about the theoretical matrix. You have all these examples that include everything from Augustine to Shakespeare, and you tend to contextualize it in terms of the argument of Foucault about sovereignty. Now, of course, the question of sovereignty is really sort of the key question. It's the overarching question within this general field that has undergone quite a revival in the last 30 years that we call political theology. And it's out of that conversational venue that the New Polis, for example, was created and so forth. So we don't deal just with political theology. I think political theology myself is somewhat of it's kind of a red herring, because very often it means in people's mind, well, I'm a theologian, I'm going to talk about politics. And that's, of course, not the original meaning. It was first formulated by the person who may not necessarily invented the term, but he gave it currency. And that, of course, was Carl Schmidt in his book in the 1920s called Political Theology, where he defines sovereignty as basically, we say, executive decision, suspending the rules and the laws for a moment. Now, I would like to hear you, if you want to kind of talk about this kind of classical notion of sovereignty in relation to your unique way of coming at it as the notion of political erasure. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind is Vladimir Putin, who in some ways seems to have suspended, not only the rules domestically, which he'd been doing all along, but even international law. We hear a lot of kind of chatter about rule-based international order. And Putin is saying, well, the rules don't apply because what's ever been going on with Ukraine, or what he thinks has been going on in Ukraine, the encroachments of NATO, blah, 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 is a matter of extreme exigency. It's existential. And, he also, in his infamous speech just before the invasion, or maybe it was right as the invasion started, I don't remember exactly, talks about, redrawing the map, that Ukraine and Russia have always been the same people, but in some ways, this is political erasure. Political erasure not only in the conceptual sense, but political erasure in the very real existential sense of annihilating a people. And it's, one doesn't have to be going on a limb to say that the actions of the Russian army, particularly the bombing of civilians, is now being perceived as acts of genocide. Whether what the international court will rule eventually, we don't know. But, clearly we're in that particular zone. So I was wondering if you could kind of look at contemporary events, and maybe you don't want to talk about Ukraine, you could talk about other examples, because you have a lot of examples in the book, but they're all really historical examples. And they're thematic examples from different time periods, and realize your background is in comparative literature, so you use a lot of those kind of references. But I was wondering if you could kind of talk about this issue of sovereignty in both the Schmittian sense and in terms of specific examples, to kind of give us a real kind of lived experience of what that might mean.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot there, so let me just take it stage by stage. Firstly, I'm happy to call this work a work of political theology, for better or worse. I don't think political theology is necessarily a very helpful term anymore, but it seems to be the one we're stuck with. For me, it's really just the site of a problematic. Okay, it's certainly not the answer to anything. I don't see it as any kind of I have no agenda, but behind it. Certainly neither a political nor a theological agenda. As far as Schmidt goes, and Schmittian political theology, I think we're still debating what that is. Everyone knows that famous statement by Schmidt about all modern concepts of the state are secularized theological concepts. But what exactly he means by that? Is that a historical claim? Is that a genealogical claim? Is it morphological claim. We don't know. Okay, I mean the bits that I find most helpful and fruitful from political theology are not so much the genealogical dimensions, but what he calls the sociology of concepts. That's his other definition of political theology, and particularly his idea that every physical form of governance, any state of governance in the world will always contain within it some kind of metaphysical worldview. And for us, it's his gambit is it's the Christian theological one, but that it doesn't always have to be. It could operate differently. So all that's a very long way of saying that for me, political theology is really just the name of a question or a problem. Sovereignty, equally. We could have a long debate about just how useful the term sovereignty really is. How overdetermined and simultaneously empty that term seems to be. The book really, the starting point from the book is a very brief moment in Foucault's "Society Must Be Defended" lectures, which, as far as I'm aware, almost nobody has ever commented on before. It's in the final lecture from 1976, I think March 1976, in which he very briefly comments, and this is, we're getting into the Foucault on biopolitics. He talks about the sovereign power of life and death, and he says, almost extemporaneously, this is a very strange thing, because if you really have sovereignty over life and death, well, it can't just be the power to kill, can it? If you have sovereignty over life, in some sense, you must be putting the subject or positioning the subject in some state before life and death, whereupon you then take the decision that they live or that they die. Okay, and he just sort of leaves that out there for a moment, and then, disappointingly, in my opinion, just defaults immediately to the idea that sovereignty is simply the right of the sword, the right to kill. So I guess what I tried to do is just actually explore, well, what would that mean? What would sovereignty over life and death, the sovereignty that's not just the power to kill, but the power to decide, what is life, what counts as life, what counts as bearable life, in my understanding. So that's just a little bit more on the theoretical armature of the book. You ask about examples. I mean, this is I'm not a kind of political scientist. There'll be people here, I think, who'll be much more qualified to speak about this. Certainly to speak about what's going on in Ukraine. The only thing I would say is, I wonder whether we speak about the rule-based international order in as much as that exists. I wonder whether, the real exception in the modern life of nations might be this moment of the rule-based international order. This is something that has existed for a relatively short period of time, and we may be going through the process in which it is now ceasing to exist. Okay, 100 years from now, 50 years from now, this is something we may look back on the international order itself as the exception to a kind of multipolar world, but that's just my own speculation. Examples of this thing called political erasure, well, they're all around us, aren't they? I mean, one of the final examples I give in the book is the phenomenon of the so-called unlawful enemy combatant, this invented legal category that was created for the Iraq War in order for the United States of America to circumvent the Geneva Convention and the specific rights that are accorded to the figure of the enemy, and to place those people in Guantanamo Bay in a kind of a legal equivalent of a black hole. And there's been quite a lot of interesting work on this phenomenon, which, although it was at the time presented as new and exceptional and revolutionary, in a sense was really just a continuation, perversely and ironically, of the practices of political disappearance that we all know of from Latin America in the 1970s, from the Middle East in the 1970s and 80s, from my home state of Northern Ireland. I grew up in Belfast in the 1970s and 80s. Political disappearance was a phenomenon there too. So I don't think we have to look very far to find really existing examples of this phenomenon called unbearable life. I think in many ways these practices, these dispositives are kind of all around us. To end where I started with, I guess, with Ukraine, is again like this gesture, the gesture of political erasure in the field of international relations, whatever you want to call it, is one of the oldest ones there is. It's the gesture of any form of settler colonialism or invasion. It's always saying, well, there was nobody here before we arrived. This was this was never anything, an independent state. It was all just desert or jungle or something like that. It's the classic colonial moment or colonial gesture of erasing its own gesture of colonization or invasion. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, that's very good. And I wanted to, again, follow up, because I think the theoretical background is very important here, because you can't talk about examples without really getting the nuances out of what we might say the whole discourse of sovereignty. By the way, I'm trying to clarify this in the latest book I'm working on, but that's neither here nor there. I want to go back to something Heather brought up, and again, some people here would be familiar with this argument, and some people would not. But that's Giorgio Agamben's rather celebrated notion of bare life, where he defines sovereignty in that term, which he also starts out the book Homo Sacer from a example from ancient Rome. So my question is, even though there's kind of alliteration here, bare life and unbearable life, what is the relationship between the two concepts? Is Agamben used as how do you innovate, and do you have any criticisms of Agamben in terms, or do you think you and him are on the same page?
Obviously it's a partly a homage to Agamben, the title, and I wanted the resonance of bare life to be heard there. But I think hopefully there's also a difference. And it goes back to where we started, which is this notion that political erasure retracts, the real horror of political erasure, the thing that makes it worse than an act of killing, right, is the fact that it retracts even the recognition that your murderer gives you. A murderer still bestows on you the recognition that you are something that exists, even if you exist purely in order to be killed. And this is a point that Emmanuel Levinas makes in Totality and Infinity. Okay, this is not a new argument that even the act of killing, killing the other, bestows this meager dignity of recognizing that person or that body as killable life. And that's my difference from Agamben, because for Agamben, effectively what bare life does is define, in the logic of the inclusive exclusion that he develops in Homo Sacer, what bare life does is expose life unconditionally and define life absolutely, purely in terms of its capacity to be killed. Bare life is killable life. It's nothing other than killable life. Okay. What I'm trying to do, what I think I'm trying to do in this concept of unbearable life, is to argue that, well, there's a life that that's even beneath bare life, that's beneath killable life, a life that perhaps does not need to be killed because it never is granted that minimal recognition of even being bare life in the first place. Okay, so all these gestures are gestures of what the gestures that I trace in the book are not gestures of killing. Paradoxically, empirically, they cash out in violence and extreme violence in all sorts of ways. But I'm trying to move beyond necropolitics, thanatopolitics, all those various gestures that define biopolitics in terms of killing and the unconditional capacity to kill life. I'm interested in Foucault speaks of something called indirect murder. To which, if we read History of Madness, Birth of the Clinic, any of those books, these are all acts of indirect murder, indirect, non-empirical violence, acts of silencing, marginalization, exclusion, which in some way philosophically foreclose the act of killing. Killing is no longer necessary, but it's redundant, or it's tautological, because that body has, is not granted the right to exist. If something does not exist, you don't have to kill it. That would be the difference for me.
Okay, and just again to kind of nuance that a little bit, Gallman uses the example of the camp, with the concentration camp from World War II, which was, of course, related to the Holocaust, which was an effort at extermination, not just killing, but extermination of a whole race. That's what we mean by meaning the term genocide, with the idea of erasing from memory, the damnatio memoriae that you talk about, and so forth. And he also talks about the Mussulman, who is neither alive nor dead in the camp. Now, I'll be honest, when I was first reading your book, I had a little bit of a problem saying, okay, what's different here? You've kind of explained that a lot, but, because I think you go where Gallman fears to tread here. I mean, you're really raising a very important issue about sovereignty is not just in the classic sense of the ability to kill, because when you talk about the state of exception, you're talking about, to use the language of the current situation, basically suspending the rules, not just the Constitution, which is probably what Schmidt had in mind with the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. And of course, it was because Germany had really been a kind of autocratic state, with kind of gestures of democracy in a lot of ways that Russia has in recent years. But he saw possibilities that were going on here that both solved the problem of the inability of parliamentary democracy to really resolve important issues, particularly when the Republic was under threat, but also in a kind of odd way, he foresaw the rise of fascism and totalitarianism, which wasn't just about fascism. You could say Stalinism was just as totalitarian, if not worse. So this question, today we don't talk about totalitarianism, we talk about autocracy. I find this a little bit specious because, where exactly is the line? But when you talk about the camp, and I'm going to use that I know you don't talk a lot about the camp, you do reference it, but what is the relationship between the camp and the figure, however you define that, who is the figure of Unbearable Life?
Yeah. I don't want to, I try not to talk about the camp because, again, I think it's become this massively over-determined figure within contemporary biopolitical theory.
It's like the word fascism has become useless in terms of our
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's one thing hopefully we can all agree on is we need some new words, right? I mean, I think we should start to talk about these things. I'm not sure of totalitarianism, fascism, appeasement, and so on. There's always this strange lag between the conceptual or political vocabulary and the political imaginary and contemporary events. In this country, unfortunately, the country where I live, everything is still seen through the frame of the Second World War, a pre-nuclear age. So we talk about people appeasing Putin and so on and so forth. I try and avoid talking about the camp for the reasons I've just suggested, except, I'd say there's one or two things that I would say which, and again, I'm not an expert on the camp. I'm not an expert on the Holocaust, so I will defer to anyone here who will say something different. But two moments, I think, or two phenomena that I think are worth drawing attention to here, that perhaps again speak more to my interest than to a Gambon's, where obviously, yes, it's genocide. Yes, it's Holocaust. Well, Agamben says it isn't Holocaust. Yes, it's mass killing. It's reducing people to Untermensch and so on and so forth. When he was announcing the Holocaust, Heinrich Himmler gives a notorious speech to the upper echelons of the Nazi Party, where he invites them all there to tell them what they're going to do. And this is partly an act of spreading the blame, spreading the responsibility, making sure that no one can say that they're out of the loop on this one. He names all the people in the audience there. We know this as a fact. But of course, what does he say? How does he describe what they're doing to the Jews at that moment in history? He says, this is a glorious page in our history that will never be written. No one will know about this. No one can know about this. And that's quite an interesting, that's an interesting moment. Why is this something that cannot be spoken about or written about, even in front of the so-called pure believers? Why does this act of political annihilation have to annihilate itself, have to erase itself? So I don't mention that in the book. In retrospect, I wish I did. But I mean, there are other touchstones here that in writing on totalitarianism that I think speak quite well to what I'm talking about. When Hannah Arendt talks about the Nacht und Nebel, the night and fog maneuvers, which again were the undercover, the secret activities, the activities that could not be spoken of and should not be spoken of. Again, these are where Nazi biopolitics, Nazi thanatopolitics enters into this territory I'm calling unbearable life.
Yeah. Let me, since I'm going to have to go here in about 15 minutes, and maybe this would be a lead-in to the Q&A to get beyond the topic of Ukraine and also the theoretical matrix. This is kind of Roger's area of expertise, which is why I've been holding off on it a little bit. And I don't know, Roger, if you'd like to jump in now while we're, just engaging directly between the moderator and our guest on this. But you brought up settler colonialism as an example. And of course, the last time we dealt with sovereignty and critical conversations, it was exactly over this. It's not just settler colonialism and the genocide of indigenous peoples, which has been happening around the world. And again, you're not dealing with some kind of monster autocrat like you have in the case of Hitler or Putin, but you're dealing with a whole process of, I'd say, the export of political institutions and the erasure of indigenous values and rights and so forth, and even through forms like cultural expropriation. This is Roger's bailiwick, and he may have something we really want to comment on this. But to what degree and in what context does this fit? The whole question of colonialism and decoloniality, as Walter Mignolo talks about. We've had Walter Mignolo, on Critical Conversations here before. The fact that in some ways, the whole question of indigeneity in a globalizing world becomes a question of political erasure. And you can say whatever in this general frame of reference you want to. I'm not asking a specific question, but you brought it up, so I'm going to give you the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a great deal to say about this, and it's not something that I want to claim any authority over. I'd be very, in a way, I'd kind of prefer to listen to people like Roger on this one. Except to reiterate my point that I suppose that I think one of the classic gestures of colonialism and of settler colonialism is a form of political erasure, isn't it? I mean, linguistic erasure, cultural erasure, institutional erasure. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, what could you come in at this point, Roger? Or
Yeah, thank you so much for this. It's like very rich for me thinking about this. So, on the question, just briefly of the camp, I'm thinking of some Black feminist thought, and particularly Alexander Wehelier's book Habeas Viscus, which is another sort of avenue on this trajectory of talking about bare life, a critique of Foucault and Agamben from a Black perspective. And in particular, one of the things, and he's not the only person to note this, but this guy, Quitman, I think is the last name, Nazis, Hitler's American model, makes this point as well, that the concentration camps that the Nazis produced are produced upon an American legalistic model for that is initiated by the reservation system. So the Indian reservation is the camp, and there's the encomienda, and there are earlier sort of iterations of that, going back to Spanish colonialism as well. But my expertise is in North America at the moment. I'm also thinking of Theodore Allen's 2-volume study on the invention of the white race, in which he traces this very much to the Ulster plantation in Northern Ireland, and looks at all of these colonial gestures. The invention of whiteness has to sort of come because of this relationship that develops with native people in the colonies after the so-called discovery of the New World, and that sort of formulates itself over a few centuries into the different iterations of whiteness that we have. My question, what I'm thinking about, what I think is very useful for me in terms of your take on Unbearable Life, and I really, really appreciate the distinctions with Bare Life and Agamben there, is that it almost feels like to me that Unbearable Life is the descent of the Basileia Tau Theo that Christianity gives, that it is the remaking over of the world in the Euro-Christian image of God that is inherently genocidal. And I know this is controversial and provocative for me to say this, but at its heart its intent is to wipe out the other. And so it becomes so difficult to speak of indigenous life, or to speak of what, Sylvia Wynter talks about, a different notion of human than what Foucault is talking about in the earlier the lectures on the psychoanalysis book. I'm forgetting the 72 lectures. So those are the things that are kind of arriving for me, and I would and just to bring it back to the earlier sort of discussion around political theology, I wonder what the theological residue might be for your concept of unbearable life. Although we see it, of course, with Putin and in this very concrete, realistic situation that's not using the kind of rhetoric of religiosity in any sort of way. But I wonder, what you might make of the theological residue in a kind of Euro-Christian sense.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something I'd have to think quite a lot more about. I mean, I'll just pick up a few sort of footnotes to what you're saying, if you don't mind. In Mein Kampf, Hitler actually says, I got my inspiration from the USA, eugenics, those guys have got the right idea over there. It's one of the sort of scarier moments in Mein Kampf, and the race laws in the southern states and so on. And obviously, and this is something I do talk about in the book, is that, you have to see the Holocaust and the genocide as the conclusion of a biopolitical program that's been going on for almost 10 years by that point, right upon Roberto Esposito talks about this very well, I think, in that right upon when the Nazis come to power, 1933, 34, they're already doing things like compulsory sterilization of undesirable peoples, so just, they're killing the future children, saying you're not allowed to have, these people are no longer allowed to have children. And this circle of sterilization becomes wider and wider. The plan was, before it was interrupted by the Second World War, is that all women over the age of 36 would be sterilized to prevent impurities in the race and this kind of thing. And again, I'm in some ways, the book is a homage to Esposito here, because he says, and I'm just quoting from memory, that yes, sovereignty is the preemptive. It's not killing. It's the preemptive foreclosure of existence. It's erasing the necessity to kill. If you sterilize somebody, if you ensure that they're unable to have children, it's a kind of virtual. I don't want to use the term genocide here, but you know what I mean, in the sense that it's an intergenerational act of violence by preventing these future people, these future children from being born. I think you're right on the money that this is a kind of, that maybe Unbearable Life is maybe it is a Christian project, maybe it is a Christian political theological project. I end one of the chapters, the chapter on Macbeth, by talking about the witch's cauldron in Macbeth, when if you remember, when they're throwing all these things in there and cooking up their diabolical spells, and what have they put in there? These are still Christian witches, because they've put in the liver of Turk, the something from the Jew, something from the unbaptized child, and this kind of thing. So it's this weird kind of Christian political theological mix of all these forms of life that are deemed unworthy of life, unworthy of being lived, but which can be Frankenstein style, mixed together in order to produce this new kind of body. Yeah, and of course, I mean, Putin is would be one example of this kind of Christian biopolitics, Christian political erasure. But as you well know, in a lot of the discourse around Ukraine in this country and in France and America, has been this incredibly offensive rhetoric that, they're like us, they're white, they're Christian, they're European. It's not like, it's not like Iraq or something like that. So we must care for them because they are like us, so it's, we have even the act of solidarity or defense contains its own violences.
If I could just jump in here, because I'm going to have to go for 5 minutes, 6 minutes, and I'm not going to ask a question, but I'm going to make a comment on this, because I think this is a very fruitful area of discussion. Of course, this is one area where Roger and I think, have significant disagreement. But you mentioned the Basileia tou Theou, or literally, which gets translated as the kingdom of God, but actually the Greek translation means more the kingship of God, and it gets basically into the Judaic monotheistic notion of the kind of unnameable God and the power of that unnameable God, which, if you want to read the Old Testament, becomes genocidal, particularly when it talks about wiping out the Canaanites. What does that mean? A lot of this discussion of being a Euro-Christian project, I would say a Euro-Christendom project. And the whole notion of Christendom, which gets in fact, part of the book that I'm working on, which Roger has made the manuscript, where I coined the term monopolitics related to monotheism. And that's different than using the word Christianity, because after all, there's also Islam, which is even more radically monotheistic, at least in its origin, than Christianity. Christianity of the three, quote, monotheistic religions is probably less the least monotheistic because it has this paradoxical notion of the Trinity, which Agamben makes a lot out of. But my point is, what does that have to do with erasure? Well, there are a lot of things that has to do with erasure. I mean, it's clear that when Columbus came to the United States, the way he treated the indigenous people was because he had this idea that he was planting the flag of, quote, Christendom, which historically comes from the idea of Romanitas, and which is associated with humanitas. Mignola makes a very strong and accurate point about this in his book, The Darker Side of Western Modernity. I would say a lot of what is used the word Christian is really a kind of monopolitical Romanitas modernist idea that has a very long genealogy to it, and it's also behind Nazi totalitarianism. And that is basically the idea that there is this kind of ultimate moral order that is God ordained, and in the case of Islam, you can see that in terms of the behavior of ISIS too. It's there in all monotheistic traditions, especially when you try to secularize or moralize these things. I mean, if you look at the whole Constantinian transformation, you can see how a lot of this process does. And I just spent my course on Christianity trying to explain this. So, we're looking at the idea of an exception, which basically says there is one culture. It is a true culture. It is a morally grounded culture in the idea of this absolute sovereign God, which is, you find that rhetoric in Schmidt, who was a Catholic, by the way, and Catholicism historically is been the basic carrier of this monotheistic, this monopolitical idea. So the issue is, and we're seeing it right now. I mean, in some kind of the paradoxes. I mean, everybody is behind Ukraine, which of course I'm behind Ukraine. I mean, this is abominable what's going on. But at the same time, you have all these subtleties which come out as like, okay, Putin has a particular idea of monopolitical, which is not the same as the Roman Catholic idea that influenced Columbus. It's an idea that goes all the way back to the 8th century. It's the Orthodox idea, the Third Rome, which he's, scholars have known about for a long time. And he's basically saying he is a guarantor of Christian values, which means, but this is an idea we don't understand. There's been a lot written about this idea of the Third Rome and the religious vision and the way Putin essentially captured the Orthodox Church, which was, was an effort of political erasure under the communist regime, and he's recaptured that and used an idea which in many ways goes back 1,000 years to try to reorder the world. But it's still it's not the idea of Christendom. It's a particular variation of Christendom, and it's been politicized. And of course, this monopolitical idea of Christendom is always politicized, but it has different kind of variations, and it is ultimately the basis of a totalitarian gesture, ultimately at some point. So you may want to respond to that. Unfortunately, I have to go now, but I wanted to get that in there. And,
dropping the mic and walking away. Yeah. So just to acknowledge that this is a fruitful tension and intellectual disagreement that Carl and I have had, and it's ongoing. And since Carl and I can talk about that all the time, I'd like to sort of first allow you, Arthur, to respond to that, and then carry over. Kieran had a question earlier, and she has a comment in here that I'll let her address next. And if anybody else in the meantime has questions, just maybe like throw yourself that I have a question in the queue, and then I'll let you carry on. But this is really great.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is there's an awful lot of food food for thought here. And I'm sympathetic to Carl. I'm not going to suggest that there is one kind of Christian project or one a monotheistic or monopolitics of Christianity. The gesture or the trajectory that I pursue in the book really is in the chapter on Augustine, which is obviously a kind of critique of Eusebian imperial Christianity in one way or another, and also a forerunner to what will become political realism, the tragic realisms of political theory in the 19th and 20th centuries, people like Hans Morgenthau and so on. But nonetheless, I'm really interested in the violence of even that kind of minimal position of Augustine, and I do a reading of quite a reading of just the really incredibly shocking passages in Book 19 of City of God around Augustine's defense of torture, where effectively he anticipates and concedes every single argument against torture that you'll ever come across. It's wrong, it doesn't work. If you torture someone, they'll just say whatever you like, whatever they think you want to hear in order to stop you torturing them. But nonetheless, you still have to torture people. And you just got to hope that God's grace will win out in the end. So it's this. So yeah, I mean, all I'm saying is I'm not. I wouldn't want to give that. The so-called realist wing of Christian political theology a free pass. Like having a bad conscience about your imperial ambitions doesn't let you off the hook, I think.
Great. Kieran, you had stuff on when I was talking, but you had a question before that, so I'm just going to turn it to you if you don't mind.
Okay. What I wrote in the chat is I'm a bit torn, fully unrelated to this conversation about Christianity and kind of imperial and colonial strategies, but it's fascinating. I think I told myself I wasn't going to make a comment on that, but now I'm going to. I think that I think there are. I would agree with Carl that there are there's more than one strategy of Christianity, and there are multiple Christianities, right? And I think it's fascinating, even this comparison between kind of Roman Catholic, this colonial universalism as opposed to the Orthodox Third Rome. I think of kind of Protestant missionizing or colonizing approaches, which are much more, they have a different anthropology, kind of, it's an entrepreneurial or even a popular or populist kind of colonization. So I think that's a fruitful discussion. And that was just speculative what I said right there, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to ask, actually, thank you for your presentation, first of all, Mr. Bradley. And I guess for this question of unbearable life, I wrote a little bit in the chat about this particularly Russian strategy of breakaway or semi-autonomous regions. And some of the examples, I've looked at these in my own work, include Nagorno-Karabakh, that is the region contested between Azerbaijan and Armenia. There's Transnistria, and that is in Moldova. The Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics play a really important role in this Ukraine conflict, as well as Crimea, annexed to Crimea. And I think this is a really interesting, it's not individual persons who are made into this form of unbearable life, as I think I've understood your argument, but it's persons and territories, the way that they're excluded from the international system and kind of in a backwards way brought under Russian imperial control, Russian centralized control. But it's also, they affect this in many cases by playing on a local ethnic conflict that's very present in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think that's a really important part of the Russian story, and I think maybe has some interesting resonances with your work. Your work is new to me, so maybe you wrote about this and can just talk from your book, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I wish I could reply. I think you know an awful lot more about this than I do. I mean, one of the things I try and do in the book is talk about, the history of this thing called Unbearable Life. I begin with damnatio memoriae in ancient Rome, where if you committed some particularly heinous crime, like treason or something like that, you wouldn't simply be killed. Your memory would be damned. Okay, that's the literal translation of damnatio memoriae. And this was something that, yeah, as I've said, you would be divested of all your properties. Anything that you had willed would be taken, it would be expropriated. Statues of you would be defaced, coins, and so on. But this was applied to a specific person, to specific individuals. In the Roman Empire were subject, and you can read about this itself. But obviously, what happens over history is, as you say, is that this concept of damnatio memoriae becomes it metastasizes, right? It just gets bigger, and it applies. It becomes racialized. It becomes regionalized. It becomes nationalized. Okay, so these are some of the examples that we could talk about here. How and when this happens is a difficult one. I talk about the French Revolution as obviously as one kind of key moment in this, when you get someone like the Abbé Sieyès writing his what is the third estate, where he effectively says, well, no, there is no third estate. There's only the third estate. There's only the people. Okay, the other estates simply don't exist. Okay, and he even speaks about the aristocracy and so on are just like a diseased part of the body, like a tumor that you simply remove. So, I mean, this is still being applied domestically. We're not in the territory of international relations here, but it's a key moment. And obviously, Sieyès did not invent the trope, the medical trope of medicalizing politics, but nonetheless, it's a key moment, I think, in that the becoming, the statifying, if you like, of this process of unbearable life. Okay, that's about as much as I can do or say in response to you. I mean, there's something else I could say about. I wanted to say something about political Judaism as well, because I don't. One of the interesting things in this book actually is or at least for me, in the case of figures like Hobbes, is the return to the Hebrew Bible, and for figures like Hobbes and Locke and so on, way more interested in the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew Bible as models of politics than they ever are in the New Testament. They do not. Abraham and Moses are cited way more than Jesus, for example. So I could say more about that at some point if people are interested, but I don't want to. It's still a Christian appropriation of Judaism. It's Christians using Judaism for political purposes, but I just wanted to throw that in there as well. But thank you very much for your comment.
Thank you. Patrick Soak has a comment.
Hey, thank you. I guess I have two questions. Brief, both of them, hopefully. One is just, do you explore the sort of in this concept of unbearable life, that maybe the most resilient and life-affirming reaction, and I'm thinking especially in the indigenous context, is self-erasure is sometimes the most life-affirming reaction that some communities have had, which is to refuse to play the sort of dialectical game of recognition, right? The politics of recognition that's required. And so some communities have simply stopped pushing against that and have kind of quietly done some really amazing things. And then 30 years down the road, the larger American community kind of hears about them, says, I never knew anybody was doing these things. And then you kind of shake your head. There's a reason you didn't, right? So I'm just wondering and then the second piece is in the German context, where you talked about the self-negating sort of component of the Holocaust, in a sense, right? Of the act that has to be itself erased. And I wonder if you dealt with Erich Voegelin's 1964 lectures, Hitler and the Germans, in which he basically says, we can't talk about Hitler. We have to talk about Hitler and the Germans. And without a morally bankrupt German middle class, there would never have been a Hitler. And he said, and in fact, I can show you the list of all of the civil servants and magistrates who were serving before the Holocaust and are still serving today in 1964. And I'm happy to give you their names. And he himself was a German, political philosopher. So anyway, it's very, very interesting. So in some ways, that whole systemic, earthworks that supported the Holocaust was itself kind of erased, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the words that unfortunately has made a recurrence in the last few years or the last few days is denazification, right? Which is a process which has a very complex history, and what on earth is going on there with this appeal to the process of denazification, that we now have Putin using it as a justification to invade Ukraine. To go back to your first point on self-erasure, I think that's an absolutely brilliant point. And I think actually that's one of the arguments that I'm really interested in, to go back to that question of how one resists this gesture of political erasure, is not simply the obvious forms of resistance, which is the reassertion of one's right to exist, one's existence, and so on, but actually that exactly what you're talking about here is that gesture of a kind of almost preemptive self-erasure, rhetorical, political, act of self-erasure, which has a really long and interesting history. I mean, I'd love to hear more about what you're talking about, but in the book, what I'm talking, again, in the chapter on the French Revolution, I do a reading of Maximilien Robespierre's political speeches, in which one of the most dominant tropes throughout Robespierre's political work is the figure of being already dead. Okay, that nothing can be done to me. I cannot be killed. I cannot be destroyed because everything has already happened. I've already given my life to the revolution. I'm already dead, and this becomes, obviously, it's got resonances that go back to there's. Goes back to Socrates, goes back to Jesus, there's martyrological references there as well. But it becomes a means of wielding political revolutionary violence. Like there's an almost kind of absurd surrealist exchange in the French National Assembly when Robespierre is being attacked by a member who's just returned from one of the sieges and is criticizing the national government. And Robespierre gives this really bizarre speech, which is that, well, I'm not going to listen to you because, if I'd been at that siege, I'd be dead now. I wouldn't have come back here in order to criticize you. So the very fact that you are alive disproves your argument. The fact that, it shows that you have this selfish commitment to your own particular existence rather than la patrie. And the trope of the already dead, we can trace it through all sorts of movements. The Zapatistas would be a great one. Subcomandante Marcos, the writings of Subcomandante Marcos, mobilize this trope of, yes, we are the already dead and so take self-erasure as a sort of site of political productivity and of revolutionary productivity.
Thanks for that response. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Suhaib Yunus has a question.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of zoom out from maybe some of the other questions and ask something that's more methodological or maybe even epistemological, depending on how you understand it. So unlike, I think, a lot of works that deal with these kinds of topics, you're bringing in a lot of literary examples. So what do you think the utility of resourcing works of Western literature in these types of discussion is, and how would you see kind of future scholarship that's broaching that's kind of bridging these two areas, that's bringing in something like Shakespeare into the discussion, both in terms of content, like, so what's within Shakespeare, what's within, fill in the blank, but also in terms of the literary itself, like the fact of the literary itself, that being something of a type of immortality, just the fact that it exists, if that's clear.
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously there's personal biographical reasons for why I am the scholar that I am, in that I've always worked somewhere in between literature, politics, philosophy. So, I wish I could tell you that it was all part of some grand master plan on my part and an entirely finely tuned methodology, but that wouldn't be true. But I mean, nevertheless, I take heart and I ally myself with, there's quite a lot of really interesting figures who are exploring that middle ground between literature, political theory, philosophy. I admire people like Eric Santner, Guy Lanijar, who, and I think there are strong methodological reasons for doing this, because Shakespeare is a political thinker, right? I mean, Shakespeare, Shakespeare both inherits and creates political concepts which will then go on to have so-called real world implications. You will get future English monarchs saying, I am Richard II, meaning I am Shakespeare's Richard II. So at that level, and then on another level, political theory is really nothing but, or is always and also a question of fiction and a question of thought experiments, a question of heuristic fictions. What is the state of nature? What is the Hobbesian state of nature? He's very clear. This is not a real place. He's not saying it ever existed. It's a kind of subtractive thought experiment. Saying, here we are sitting in our Commonwealth, here we are sitting in our sort of post-Civil War society. What would it be like if we subtracted everything? What would be left? So it's a work of eliminative. It's an eliminative thought experiment. And I quote in the book as well that wonderful thought experiment that Hobbes gives, where he talks about who decides when a malformed baby, when is born, when this kind of prodigy or something is born. Who decides whether it's a man or a human being or not? Is it Aristotle? Is it the philosophers? No, it's only the sovereign will decide whether that child is a human being or not. So it's something I'm kind of exploring this in a little bit more in my contemporary. I'm writing a project at the minute about political theory and theater, which is about the relationship between two, not simply theater in the sense of dramatic works, but in the sense that theory and theater are two both opposed but interwoven forms of phenomenology, forms of political thinking that go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. I mean, theoria in the Greek is, at least in its inheritance and the idea that we have of it today, is supposedly the pure disinterested contemplation of the forms, the bedazzlement or wonder. Theatron in the Greek, they both come from the same link, theoria and theatron. They both come from thea, to see. Theatron is a more interested, situated form of phenomenology, a form of seeing. It's someone who is placed in a specific position in order to see. And these two forms of, as I said, of political vision, political phenomenology, are interwoven in really interesting ways, right from the beginning of the Western political tradition in Plato himself. So to put it really crudely, I don't want to draw a distinction between literature over here and political theory or philosophy over here. I think the distinction between them is far more blurred and nuanced than that. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I have a lot of thoughts on that, and thank you, Suhaib, for asking that question, because this is a particular concern of mine as well, that how the literary gets used as a rhetorical gesture in
Yes.
discourse in general. So there's one comment in the chat. Aaron Aquilina says, "I'm afraid to leave." Oh, okay, but there's not a question there, so I'm just sort of reading that out loud. So, sorry, you have to leave. Are there any other questions, or I can carry on, but I want to make sure other people who have questions to have a chance to.
I do have one on like the power of political erasure and like the global context. So Foucault, to use Foucault, he has this concept of the regime of truth that uses knowledge power in order to establish its ideas of true and false, which is in Foucault an eternal act of attempts to erase and control, like madness, delinquency, sexuality. But is political erasure like an external exercise of this sort of attempts of a regime of truth to establish its knowledge power and like the validity and lawful existence of an other? That's the first part of my question. And then my global context is like, is this even possible for like a true erasure to take place in the global context, seeing as how that we're sort of sharing like an active development of a cooperative history, that although an erasure can be attempted through the demolition of a state, if that were at all possible, would it be the fault of the whole global community as a whole for allowing that erasure to take place, since we are all sort of in a global context of being able to witness and watch and participate in whatever, or not participate in attempts of erasure?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's great questions. I mean, I think one, to take the second one in particular, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in that there is a sort of irony that accompanies every act of political erasure that we're talking about today, which is that if they worked, we wouldn't be talking about them. We wouldn't have know they happened. Okay, so these are all failed acts of political erasure, and acts that for whatever reason did not work. Which is not to say that there have been some that did work. Okay, we don't. That's an unknown for us, right? Is that we that there may be many out there that did operate. And one of the things I am really interested in is why exactly, why do they fail? Where does this failure come from? And some of them are in fact not are a strange combination of exhibitionism and secrecy at the same time, because one of the features of damnatio memoriae, if you go back to ancient Rome, was that this would be both an erasure, but it would be a kind of publicly proclaimed, visible act of erasure. So, you would deface a statue of a disgraced person, but you wouldn't remove the statue. You would want everyone to know that this person was no longer to be spoken of or to be known or remembered. So there's this interesting kind of gesture here, and this plays through in of course into lots of different places and contexts as well. But I guess there's more. Is there more of a structural reason why this act of erasure fails or has to be continually reasserted? Judith Butler makes the point in one of her books on precarious life, I think, that the very tautological nature of political erasure, where you're erasing something which you say does not exist. I'm going to, this thing does not exist. The statement, this thing does not exist, is kind of self-contradictory, becomes self-defeating because it has to be continually reasserted. But at the same time, with every reassertion, kind of renders it in some sense redundant and emboldens or empowers the thing that you're saying does not exist. And one of the things, to go back to the point about self-erasure, which is the point that the previous speaker raised, I think one of the powers of self-erasure, even as a rhetorical or political strategy, or one of the opportunities it offers, is that if you say, you're right, I don't exist, I'm not here, I do not occupy a space and time, I'm already dead, all those things. And this is a gesture that we can find as I said, from revolutionary France up to movements like Anonymous and so on today. You cannot find, I'm everywhere, I'm legion, I'm nowhere, all this kind of stuff. Well, then how can you erase it? How can you erase that which has already preemptively negated itself? It's, has done that act for you. So it's both already dead, but perversely unkillable, unerasable. I don't know if that answers your questions at all.
Yeah, no, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate that.
There was one other question, but the person had to leave, and so the floor is open, or I will ask one. There is something, Arthur. You mentioned that you have a new project in the works. Going back to the question of the literary and the erasure question makes me think of multiple times in the conversation today. I've thought of Samuel Beckett, and I've thought of Endgame, maybe more than Godot, but also the character of Ubuwa, right? The pataphysics and these very 20th century gestures about the erasure of sovereignty itself. But I'm kind of hearing it in a new register with this concept of unbearable life. I don't know if you have thoughts or where you're going to dig.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we should obviously talk more about this because I said the book that I'm currently writing is called, provisionally, is called In the Theater of Sovereignty, and as I said, it's about the relationship between theory and theater, in both the literal sense, and I examine quite a lot of political. I look at Shakespeare, I look at Schiller, I look at Genet, Ionesco, figures like that. So I am interested in actual theater and representations of sovereignty in theater, but I'm also interested in theater in the more expanded sense of, the particular form of political phenomenology, I suppose, that theater represents, and whether and how that interacts with theory. And I think there is maybe I don't want to say too much here about it because it would be going down another tangent. But there's been some really interesting figures like Genet. If you go back and you read Le Balcon or something like that, Ionesco, if you read Les Chaises and so on. I mean, these are absolutely saturated in political theology. For those of you who don't know the play, in the case of Le Balcon in Genet, the balcony it's a brothel, okay? And it's a place where people go and they're given the opportunity to dress up as people, so it's a kind of role-playing brothel, and it has numerous studios in it. But the studios are all like a kind of, or like an archive of political theology. So you can dress up as Saint Sebastian, you can dress up as a nun, you can dress up as a pope, you can even dress up as Jesus. So it's all like, it's a strange sort of, I call it a kind of like Kraft Ebing, like a kind of political theologica sexualis, that it's this sort of secret inventory of political theology. And the really interesting thing about, and it's all about the clothes. It's all about the ornamental, the appearance, the theater of political theology. They don't actually want to be a real bishop. They don't want to wield any real power. They just want to look like one. And the interesting thing is this play appears in the 1950s at the same time as there's a bunch of really fascinating work, political scholarly work on precisely this dimension of the symbolics of sovereignty, not only Kantorowicz, but also people like Percy Ernst Schramm, like his work on, he calls them the symbols of power. He does these wonderful analyses of crowns and robes and scepters and all this kind of this stuff. So what I'm interested in is the theatrics of power, but the theatrics of power is not simply the veneer or the external surface or skin that would conceal some kind of realpolitik beneath, but as something essential to the operation of sovereignty itself. And I think James I says in his book that to be a sovereign is to be on stage. Is that you're always on stage, even when you're alone, you're still on stage. That you are a political actor, and of course Hobbes and Machiavelli and lots of people will speak about the relationship between political action and dramatic action too. So that's kind of what I'm interested in now. It's it's tangential to Unbearable Life, but there are some parallels there.
Thank you. Kieran, you have a question.
Yeah, just a very short question on this Theater of Sovereignty project. Do you engage with Jean Baudrillard's work on kind of the spectacle of war? I think that's also a really an interesting conversation for this moment. And of course, it's a different kind of, he does more with, he does a lot with the image, right? And kind of the stage, but not the more technological metaphors than these more classical ones. But do you work with that and these kinds of ideas of like the Iraq War never happened and what we do with the spectacle of conflict and violence? Yeah,
I don't actually. I mean, I not for any grand theoretical reason. I mean, I remember I was a PhD student, so it was a long time ago. I remember when that book came out and caused a great deal of fuss and was itself, although it's a book about erasure, was itself kind of systematically erased, and that its argument was utterly traduced in the media, and it was just used as, at the time, this is way before your time, but people who are my age will remember this, and that it was kind of ridiculed. It was held up in the same way that people like Agamben have been ridiculed recently over COVID-19 as an example of, here's another crazy French philosopher, just saying something crazy or contrarian. It's obviously a very serious, important engagement in the mediatics, the media theater of war. Yeah, I don't engage with it. Maybe, I should have done probably. Thanks.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Jared.
So I was wondering if you could talk about invisibility as a liberatory kind of avenue, in the sense that it seems to me that which is invisible in that sense is so, from the perspective of being engulfed in sovereignty and the real that it builds for itself that you talk about at the end of your book. Yeah. And it seems that there's maybe some kind of ecological resonance there where one could make that invisible visible by kind of trying to move past the life, non-life distinction. To kind of get past the power of sovereignty to decide what exists and what doesn't.
Could you say a little bit more about the ecological?
Yeah, I mean, I think in certain ways it kind of, I was thinking about this in terms of Patrick's question and kind of indigenous issues to begin with, about not having a concept of inanimate objects, and once that's the case, then you can't decide what exists and what doesn't from a sovereign perspective, because life isn't the basis of existence.
That's great. I mean, it's not something there's been a lot of interesting work recently on animism and reanimating debates around animism, Descola and people like that. Which I find really interesting. It's not something I know an awful lot about. I still want to hold on to invisibility, I suppose, and I quite like the trope of invisibility as a form of as a political position. And obviously, in recent years, invisibility has taken on a certain kind of currency in political theory, with the Invisible Committee and the Luther Blissett movement in Italy, and also the movements like Anonymous and so on. There's a wonderful German artist called Hito Style, who's done a great installation which you can watch on YouTube called How Not to Be Seen, and it's a series of kind of both comic and half serious, half comic explorations of how to become invisible, some of which are, wonderful and fantastic in the sense of be a superhero, have an invisibility cloak, and some of which are utterly mundane, in which she says, be a woman over 50. You'll be in, congratulations, you're now invisible, and this kind of thing. It's just, it's a really wonderful, playful exploration of the different ways in which, we can be politically invisible, both for better or worse. So yeah, I really like her work.
Other question? I think that the visible and invisible discussion is, amplifies this project on theatrics that you're thinking about, and one of the reasons why I think it's important maybe to keep that gesture alive in this conversation is because other famous philosophers, Alain Badiou, Simon Critchley. Badiou is not maybe operating so much in political theology, but they have both written books about like the poets of the modern age, and they've focused on people like Stevenson, who's a very, very quiet and silent poet, and that moment in the 1950s where the post-war moment where Heidegger is very much returning to poetry. And Cantoriowicz, of course, is in the States by this time, but there is this sort of, in the exhaustive moment of war-torn annihilation, there's this return to aesthetics that I'm very fascinated with, but especially the theatricality of this, and of course my indigenous friends. When we were at a Four Directions march a few months ago here in Denver, and it was very quiet and unseen in the city, and the city's all lit up, and we've marched a few miles to this little park where there's a ceremony going on, and my indigenous colleagues are insistent that this is not theater. This is not performance, because so much of anthropology has cast their ideations about indigenous people in terms of the language of performance.
Really interesting. Yeah. One of the gestures that, you're right to mention Badiou. I think, there's a great line where in a piece he wrote about Foucault, Badiou says, I only ever used to run into Michel at the theater because we both love the theater, that was what they had in common. And of course, like there's as you well know, like there's quite a long tradition of, Rancière, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, like all these, writers who have, either been theater practitioners, like Lacoue-Labarthe was himself a practitioner, and also written about the politics of theater and theater as politics. One of the things that interests me, I guess, is, years ago, about 40 years ago, there was a guy called Barish who wrote a book called The Anti-Theatrical Prejudice, and it was the development of the critique of theater in politics and culture from the 17th century to today, where the theater effectively, under the Puritans it was banned, but the theatrical became a byword for everything that politics wasn't and shouldn't be. In political theory, one of the things I try and argue is that political theory defines itself very much against theory. Theory that theory is partial, theory is situated, theater is partial, theater is interested, theater is situated. Political theory is allegedly, at least, none of these things. It's the view from nowhere. It's not a particular perspective upon these problems. I'm going to try and challenge that. I think political theory, political science is itself, I don't think it's a particularly complicated or controversial thing to say, is not the view from nowhere. It's very much the view from somewhere. I think it's, the development of the discipline of international relations itself. You could go so far as to say that it is, it is the discourse of imperialism, colonialism. To go back to Foucault and knowledge and power. It's the knowledge form of that knowledge power equation in modernity, the development of these disciplines. And of course, like if you go back to Plato and even go back to Plato's cave, what is Plato's cave? It's a kind of theater, right? It's like we're sitting there watching a bunch of people watching thaumatopoi, puppets on a screen. So it's at the very beginning of this thing called political theory, you have a miniature sort of puppet theater, marionette theater, right at the very beginning there. So sorry, that's just a set of random stream of association or stream of consciousness thoughts in response to your question.
Tom Grimwood has a question.
Hi, I hope my bandwidth works out. Hi, Arthur. Good to see you.
Tom. Hi.
I'm trying not to dwell on the theatrical book because I'm aware that's the next one. But of course, what I always find interesting about the theatre is the kind of treatment of it in the 18th, 19th century. When it was this den of gossip and inequity, and it was very much a lower class thing, and this just got me thinking back to the issue of erasure, and to what extent, and I'm trying to think how to choose my words here, to what extent that idea of erasing life is a fantasy of political sovereignty. Compared to to use Deserto because why not? Whereas it's a strategic fantasy, but tactically you could see it. Can you erase things tactically? Can you erase things in that everyday gossip fueled everyday interaction, or is that an impossible thing to know?
Yeah, that's great, Tom. I really like that. And he even the metaphor that Certeau uses, as is la perruque, the wig, as the means. It's a form of invisibility. That tactical invisibility is calling in sick when you're not really sick, to not go to work that day. Wearing a wig to cover up your baldness. Whatever. It's these, and it's very interesting. It's these moments of tactical disguise or camouflage or something like that. I think to try and build a bridge between what I was doing in Unbearable Life and this stuff that we're talking about in relation to theater is that there are two sides of the same project in a way, which is a sort of exercise in political phenomenology, which is Rancière famously talks about the distribution of the sensible. Okay, so politics is an aesthetic phenomenon, not just in the sense of real theater and real novels, but in the Kantian sense of sensible experience itself. And that politics is an exercise in arranging, distributing, choreographing what counts as a sensible experience and what doesn't. So what appears and what disappears, what is erased and what is brought sharply into focus. So I guess Unbearable Life is very much about the shade, and the new project is more about the light. Okay, but the two things, there's in Italian, if anyone knows their art history, chiaroscuro is this wonderful Italian word of the play of light and shade that go together. These are very much part of the same project. In rendering something visible, you are almost by definition rendering something else invisible. By making something appear, you are distancing or marginalizing or disappearing something else.
Great. I want to correct something I said earlier with Simon Critchley. It's Stevens, Wallace Stevens, not Stevenson.
Yeah.
Robert Louis Stevenson is not necessarily quiet, but Stevens is. So, just correcting myself on the record. But Kieran, you have a hand up there.
Another question, I guess I hate to ask you to give spoilers for your next project, but in this, so you don't have to answer this, but in the Theater of Sovereignty, what role does the audience play for you? Because I think in this play of light and dark, there and who's seen and who's not seen, that's really important. Like what is on stage for the audience in politics and in theater is really important. This conversation reminded me of The Kingdom and the Glory, Agamben's discourse. He talks about this politics of acclamation in that in these conversations between Carl Schmidt and that Christian theologian that I forgot the name of. But what is the audience? What is their relationship to sovereignty?
Yeah, great question. I wish I could give you a spoiler alert, but I haven't quite got that far yet, so I'd be spoiling it for myself as well. I mean, the way in which the project is working at the moment is actually I'm trying to tell this story in 6 or 7 different scenes. And in each one, I'm not focusing on a particular writer or a particular text. I'm actually focusing on the history of a particular prop or property. You know, the word prop on stage comes from property. So I have a chapter on chairs. I have a chapter on clothes. I have a chapter on anointing oils. I have a chapter on puppet shows. So it's quite eclectic. So if you thought Unbearable Life was a little bit too playful for you, then the next one is unfortunately even more so. The question of the audience is an absolutely wonderful one. The only way I can answer this is one of the great gestures of modern theater, obviously in Brecht and Ionesco and so on, is the alienation, breaking of the fourth wall, all these where the audience is effectively put on stage. Yeah. And there's a wonderful moment right at the end of Jean Genet's play, Le Balcon, the balcony, which, as I said, it's set in a brothel, okay? And a brothel in the midst of a revolution. So a revolution is happening outside, and inside everyone is dressing up as political leaders. You know, it's an absolute masterpiece. If you haven't read it, take a look at it. But the final scene of the balcony is when the madame of the brothel keeper is this woman called Irma, and she breaks the fourth wall by turning to the audience and saying, I'm terribly sorry, but the balcony is now closed for the evening. So go home, but we'll be back tomorrow night, at 7:30 if you want to come back. So in a sense, everyone in the play becomes a paying customer, right? Everyone is put on stage. There is no spectator. Everyone is a participant. Everyone is a fetishist. And the metaphor of the balcony and of the role play becomes generalized and extended to swallow up the audience as well.
Yeah. Were you going to say something else, Kieran?
Just thank you. Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm thinking very much of Artaud, Antonin Artaud, in the Theater of Cruelty here, and also the fact that Lacan declared Antonin Artaud uncurable in his madness, and Foucault, of course, and Deleuze, the 60s French post-structuralists are consumed with this question of madness, from which the discussion of sovereignty and biopolitics sort of morphs. So I'm really intrigued at the intersections of lots of late 20th century thought here.
Sure. I mean, it's really interesting in the case of Genet as well, is the only person who really identifies the political theological dimension to Genet is Derrida in Glas, like where he actually says that Genet is obsessed with glory. Like the word glory, it appears constantly in the balcony, and the play is about nothing other than I think it was mentioned earlier on. It is about the kingdom and the glory. It's about, why does power need glory? Why does the does the exercise of political sovereignty, political rule, need this apparently additional supplement or dimension of glory and self-glorification and vicarious glorification and so on. So yeah, that's kind of where I am at the moment.
Yeah, it takes me very back to last month's critical conversation on the New Polis, which was on my book. But at the end, when we were kind of in the weeds of discussion, I had been trying to talk about the 1968 moment, or of the levitation of the Pentagon protest, which is very theatrical, and it's influenced by the living theater and Artaud's influence on the States and psychedelics. But comparing that to January 6th of last year, and there's this impulse where I want to say, like, yeah, of course there's something way less enchanted, in last year's performance at the Capitol, if we're going to call it a performance. It's not an attempt to levitate. I can't see the people from last year doing that, and so there might be something dialectic about that. But the crossover here is that the glorification part, whether we're talking about the QAnon shaman or other very, very theatrical figures, nevertheless. Although the strategy or the agenda or something is quite different, and I'm not sure how to parse all of this. It's but sometimes I can come across as like, well, of course there was a difference. It was much more peaceful in '68 than it was. That they didn't, break down the doors and, like break into people's offices and all of that. Yes, I'm aware of the differences and the violent tendencies, but the resonance of glorification and patriotism crosses over. That both groups would say that they're raising American flags, or they're doing something nationalistic.
Yeah, I mean, look, you would know way more about this than me. I mean, I watched the Netflix, was it the Netflix documentary, or there was the doc about the January 6th, and yeah, it was kind of astonishing in all sorts of ways, particularly when they occupied the Senate floor, whereas this sense that they didn't quite know what to do when they were there, and that they just sort of wandered around and sat in the chair, sat in the speaker's chair and things like that.
Yeah.
But I remember, a guard, one of the guards comes in and says, this is a sacred space, to which they all sort of say, yeah, you're right. We're not, don't worry, we're not going to mess it up, which is a really interesting moment, right? And then you just think, like, what on earth is going on there in terms of, the language of glory as well. And, at some level, they are true believers in representative democracy, even as they're in the process of destroying it,
Well, I wonder if we could, as we're, and please jump in if you have questions, but I'm thinking of ways to wrap this up, and towards the end of your book, of course, you end up with Benjamin in the current book, and Benjamin has this famous, dialogue with Schmidt, saying that he credits Schmidt with his conception of aesthetics, that he builds the Trauerspiel book, The Origins of German Tragic Drama. He credits Schmidt's work, I think, in The Dictator or Political Theology. Both of them sort of crossed over the early 1920s Schmidt. With this aesthetic conception, but of course coming from a completely different political and as Jewish as well positionality, even if it be so-called secular Jewish. I don't know how that term really works for someone like Benjamin. And then that book was about 17th century theater, right? It does seem very, very relevant, even to the Unbearable Life book. I wonder if you maybe had some thoughts about Benjamin and theatricality and how this is.
Yeah, I mean, Benjamin plays quite a big role in spoiler alert in the current book for exactly the reasons that you mentioned. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to go along with Agamben's suggestion that there's some kind of esoteric dossier of where Schmidt and Benjamin are talking to each other in these works, literally, to see that think that the relationship between them is incredibly rich. I mean, I guess I wouldn't disagree with anything that you say, but one footnote to it would be that a text that I've written a chapter on the figure of the antechamber in political theory and in drama and so on. So I look at Benjamin, I look at Kafka, and I look at Schiller's Don Carlos. But the inspiration for it really is a post-war essay, a post-war newspaper article by Carl Schmidt, which was published in Der Spiegel in about 1955, and it's called "In the Antechamber of Power: Vorraum der Macht." And it's incredibly Benjaminian, without ever mentioning Benjamin, but everything that we normally attribute to the Benjaminian critique of Schmidt, creaturely sovereignty, Trauerspiel, and all that kind of thing, is suddenly massively present in Schmidt. And it's about, there's this poor figure of the sovereign who they can't do everything, they can't take all the decisions, and that's why we have the figure of the courtier. That's why we have the figure of the servant, the mistress, and suddenly the court. The sovereign is surrounded by a court, and once you have a court, you have plots and intrigue and all that Benjaminian stuff. And it's a really fascinating essay because it's kind of very un-Schmittian, a very Benjaminian version of Schmidt. And to what extent it's compatible with the early Schmidt, because interestingly, Schmidt, the figure of the antechamber occurs several times in Schmidt, in the big works. It's there in can't remember which ones, but the great works of the 1920s, and it's always negative. It's always just the antechamber is where they don't take decisions. The antechamber is the place of, it's the debating hall. It's the talking shop. It's the place where no one does anything. But then suddenly the antechamber emerges in this very different framework in the later Schmidt. So maybe we could talk more about this.
Yes, of course. This is the moment of Hamlet or Hecuba.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. So it's but the argument is even subtly different from Hamlet and Hecuba as well.
Yeah. Thank you. I've carried on this conversation, but if there's anyone who hasn't spoken, who's had a question and been waiting to get in, and I keep trying to look at if you raise your hand, I can't see you all the time, because I can only see 4 people on the screen. I'm gauging by the silence that this is a good stopping point, at least for now, but this has been a really great conversation. Thank you so much. The highlight of my week.
Highlight of my week. And, I want to thank you, Roger, and thank everybody for your, I know everybody's incredibly busy with their own work, and it's been great to hear a little bit about your projects as well. And please, if you want to follow up anything that we've been talking about today, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I'd be very happy to chat to you all. But I mean, thank you so much for your attention. It's been a great honor for me to have this opportunity to speak to you all about my work.
Yeah, very much so. Likewise. Okay. Everyone has a great rest of your day or night, wherever you are in the world. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you.